Just to situate myself, I am speaking from my experience as one of 60 lead authors of the assessment on the diverse value evaluation of nature for IPBES. IPBES is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Interface Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, briefly the IPCC of Biodiversity. And this is what I've done the last 4 years. I was nominated and selected as one of 60 lead authors. For the first time, probably in the history of this thing, there were philosophers in that bunch, not just ecologists, sociologists, economists, but philosophers, which made things, probably my colleagues would say, more difficult for them, but it was very exciting and interesting for me. So I spent it was an incredible amount of time spent to work on this policy advice type of work. So I haven't done a lot of traditional philosophy thinking for a while, although this is my background. So my reflections today are rooted in this experience, an attempt at reconsidering how Whitehead can not only help rethinking the value of nature, but also dialogue with decolonial critique against hegemonic paradigms revolving around the concept of nature. So as I said, I will not speak much about Whitehead, but show trajectories that thinking with Whitehead might open, and that can bring us further than what has been considered so far Whiteheadian environmental ethics. And I hope to be provocative. Just again, to situate myself very briefly, I want to present my trajectory, or at least a brief overview of my personal contribution as Whiteheadian thinker to the environmental ethics debate that has originated by my disappointment with what you see in my background. The disappointment with the traditional environmental ethics debate that is still so influential out there, and I am sorry to say it is still influential among Whiteheadian environmental philosophers and environmental ethicists, and I think that we can do way more and way better with Whitehead, going beyond this kind of dualism between, on the one hand, intrinsic value, the value of nature for its own sake, and on the other hand, instrumental value, the value of nature for society. This is not just a matter of theoretical narrative. This is something that has heavily influenced also policy discourse in biodiversity. What you see here is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and an important quote. For philosophers like me, it's amazing to see a document like that to start quoting Kant, but it's also very problematic to see that it reproduces this dichotomy between a narrow understanding of intrinsic value in terms of dignity on the one hand, and instrumental value in terms of price on the other hand. The point is that also methods of valuation, of assessing how and why people value their relationship with nature or nature, have been developed from this framework, and are very narrow and limited for this reason. First of all, the realistic framework, on the one hand, reduces anything that cannot be attributed dignity or moral worth to a mere means, therefore reducing all relations to means-ends relationships. On the other hand, it focuses on the value of individual entities, neglecting processes and dynamics. More than anything, this abstract dichotomous representation does not correspond to what people actually say about why nature matters to them, or biodiversity matters to them, and does not adequately reflect other ways of understanding nature-society relations beyond, for example, the dominant Western model of thought. So, back when I was doing my PhD, such a long time ago right now, I worked on developing, based on Whitehead philosophy, a relational axiology that starts really with rethinking axiology beyond the debate between a subjectivist and an objectivist axiology. I'm not going into detail here. You're all familiar with Whitehead, and it's obviously the case that with Whitehead, one cannot think in terms of values as a tertiary property. It's not that you are there as a subject, encounter a world of objects, and know them, interact with them, and then value them as a value judgment. Rethinking that, for me, has to challenge radically the way in which also Whiteheadian environmental ethics has been conducted, which have been focused on different understanding of intrinsic values or extrinsic or ecological values, but there is a way of doing it more radically, I think. From this point of view, values is a relational locus that precedes and constitutes the distinction between subject and object. It is really the point that is made in modes of thought, for example, have a care, here is something that matters. Value is something pre-thematic, pre-conscious, something that precognitive, that is the foundational vague relationship with the world from which subject and object arise in the first place. So value emerges from relationships and constitutes both subject and object. But I also developed my own contribution to, I was supposed to go into details, but I won't, to environmental ethics from a Whiteheadian perspective, not just by rethinking the process of value as a process, but also the attribution of value. In the traditional dichotomy, you have intrinsic and instrumental values. I maintained the Kantian framework of inherent moral value, but I reformulate what at that time seemed to be a good word, which is introducing relational values. And I consider instrumental values as a subcategory of relational values, specific relationships that are framed in terms of means to ends. It's just one modality of relationship. And I could go into all the details, which I won't, and if you are interested, I'm happy to talk about that. Trying to articulate different modalities of relation and relationships, not just instrumental ones. And by bringing together Whiteheadian and Heidegger, I developed the fundamental relational values, eudaimonic and constitutive. I think it was a tentative taxonomy, and to my own surprise, this was published in 2011 in Environmental Values and in my own dissertation in German, one of these terrible German dissertation books that you can kill people with, but if you're interested, it's never going to translate. It was very successful to my own surprise. It was adopted in empirical works and proved to be able to articulate something that was not accessible before. It did, in fact, open a space of dialogue with perspectives that could not be framed in terms of intrinsic or instrumental values. As usual with kids, when they grow up, they become something different from what you expected them to be. So relational values has its own life, and it became slightly different from how I framed it. In particular, I think for strategic reason, it was used as a third category of value, along instrumental and intrinsic, whereas in my own framework, instrumental was a subcategory of relational values. But it was very important strategically because of the dominance of the dichotomic understanding that was out there. And this is a paper that was published in PNAS with colleagues, where that was kind of brought down to bear onto actual issues, environmental issues. And I don't want to go into details, but then you can, when I talk about empirical research, this is a very important research done by a brilliant ecological economist from Colombia who really did interviews out there, and you can see how relevant references to relational values are once you frame it in terms of interviews. I call this the afterlives of relational values. It ended up being adopted by IPBES in the global assessment in 2019 as a third category, and the definition that it was attributed to it was relational values as a value refers to preferences, principles, and virtues associated with relationships. It was narrowed down to be considered in terms of the value of and about relationships. But both relationship between people and nature and relationship among people through nature. Moreover, as a third category, it has a certain level of overlapping with both intrinsic and instrumental values. And more specifically, it was defined as referring to non-instrumental and non-substitutable relationship. Because relationships which are constitutive of individual and collective identities, referring to reciprocal relationship, and in many of the languages that you find out there in biodiversity research, environmental discourses, sense of place, specific relationships to what in IPBES are called contextual nature contributions to people, contextual NCP, but also processes, not only individual entities. This is from the IPBES global assessment. It is simplified. The whole complexity of a Whiteheadian framework cannot be brought down to bear onto policy and the language for policymakers, but there you see some of the way in which relational values are intended as anthropocentric and non-instrumental values of relationships. So summing up this first part about the potential of relational values, the framework of relational values has proved to be able to challenge traditional dichotomies in environmentalism and to be a bridge for alternative expression of value rooted in non-Western traditions. It has proved to have a transdisciplinary potential because it focuses on practices, stories, local relevance to communities, rather than meta-ethics. And it has been taken on by social science, for example, ethnographers, etc. And it has a link to discourse of epistemic and environmental justice. And it has an opportunity to challenge universalism by focusing on contextual and local relationships as they're embedded in practices, and also situating knowledge. However, and this is why I'm not interested in going into details here, because I am at a point in which I say, sounds great, and it's problematic. Because there is also risk attached to using this framework of making it into a superficial relational narrative that misses decolonial critique. Use, for example, as the value of something to someone reproduces a kind of chunking of reality, which, from a Whiteheadian perspective, is problematic as such, but it's also problematic in terms of that kind of relational ontology that makes us all feel innocent about the traditional Western tradition of thought, but then in this superficial way, it reproduces modality of coloniality, as I will articulate in the following part of my talk. So when thinking about the future of relational values, which is what I want to do from now on, and I have been doing in the last couple of years, is really to think about the colonial possibility, which I consider to be out there, moving not only, but also with a more radical understanding of Whitehead's philosophy of organism. And this is the thinking with Whitehead that I'm going to propose here, trying to extract elements that can be interesting into that direction. Before doing that, however, I want to look into the risk of that incorporation of a relational narrative that makes us feel innocent in terms of addressing, and having already addressed and solved the colonial issues. And I want to do it starting with IPBES. IPBES has, from its onset, committed, other than the IPCC, very strongly to considering what in IPBES are called ILK, indigenous and local knowledge, as an essential component of the assessments that are generated and produced for policymakers. And that has led from the beginning to very heated discussion around the concept of nature, because many knowledge systems outside of the so-called modern Western world do not have a concept of nature. There is no word for nature. It makes no sense to have a word for nature. Not that it can be translated somehow, but it doesn't exist. So from the onset in IPBES, there has been a lot of discussion with representatives of local and indigenous communities or people working with them about how colonial the term nature itself is. What was the solution? The solution you can find in the glossary of IPBES. And I give you a couple of seconds to read it. The solution that IPBES proposed was we cannot do without nature. So a way is to use the term nature, as an overarching term that includes both the Western science tradition of understanding nature and other traditions rooted in other knowledge systems. So despite the reflexivity of the coloniality of nature, in the end, other approaches and other knowledge systems end up being included in the Western concept of nature. And this is rooted in what Arturo Escobar, a decolonial anthropologist, calls the coloniality of nature. Nature is at the same time a vague and obvious concept, difficult to define and impossible to avoid. I try to, whenever I start teaching environmental philosophy, I start asking my students to define nature. It's wonderful. We do a word cloud. There's so many different definitions, but we all know what it is, right? And yet, it's obvious and vague at the same time. So despite the critique, it seems impossible to do without it, or even to start questioning it. And I want to play a little with words. This is not meant in a strict philosophical sense, but you could use Kant in a playful way to say that nature is a transcendental of Western modernity, or modernities, because there is not just one. Both in the sense of being a condition, the condition of possibility for the self-understanding of Western modernity, and a synthesis of a manifold of the various experiences of what nature is. As the anthropology of Arturo Escobar writes, there is a coloniality of nature that has to be unveiled. And that coloniality of nature leads to the subalternization of a multiplicity of local nature culture regimes that are eradicated or included into the Western concept of nature, but they're made invisible in their own terms and with their own language. So it leads to the eradication of all those worldling practices that do not only not fit the hegemonic scheme of intelligibility of Western modernity and of colonial nature, but also threaten it in its foundations and legitimation. This is not just a question of a mental construct, of course, it's also materialized by the construction of what Jason Moore calls abstract social nature. I'm not going into that, I just want to mention it as an additional element in this discussion. Or to follow De la Cadena, also an anthropologist from Peru, it leads to silences of and a war against other world-making practices that ignore the separation of entities into nature and culture. This is not about different interpretations of the same world, but about different worlds. And as Law calls it, the one-world world is rooted of the self-understanding Western modernities, is rooted in the assumption that the world is something like a large space-time box that goes on by itself, and that there are people with different beliefs living in their space-time box. And is enacted by colonial processes whereby heterogeneous assemblages of life that do not necessarily make themselves using the division between humans and non-humans are both obliged into that distinction and continue to exist, exceeding and resisting it. So now I'm moving to the core point of what I'm trying to do here. What are the colonial possibilities, having presented that with Whitehead and in Whitehead and beyond Whitehead, but moving forward with him? I do think that thinking with Whitehead can contribute a more radical perspective in the relational term that is taking place in sustainability, and that can also address the coloniality of nature. Of course, Whitehead remains a white, British, privileged male dude, and he's not a decolonial thinker. But I feel encouraged by having this project by the fact that he has been actually mentioned as a rare exception within the Western Eurocentric tradition by, for example, indigenous philosophers like Vine Deloria from the Standing Rock Sioux Nation. Deloria considers Whitehead a proto-locality philosopher and uses him to unmask the delocalization, it's a word that Deloria uses a lot, the delocalization of Western philosophy as a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. More recently, this is just a quote I'm not going into, but it gives you a sense, Cherokee philosopher Brian Burkert has taken on this perspective to articulate a philosophy through the land, and Burkert does refer to Whitehead a lot in his book. And I want to share another quote by Brian Burker, which I think is relevant for the discussion we're having today. He challenges the traditional understanding of both intrinsic and instrumental value and proposes, in a way, in his own way, which is definitely different from mine, but he does use the term relational values. Here you can see neither intrinsic nor instrumental value can be a correct way to account for our moral obligations to non-humans. Nothing has value in isolation, which means that think as a static and isolated node of reality would have no value whatever. This could be Whitehead, pretty close in that sense. Here Burker articulates the omnipresence of value in terms of sacredness and considers sacredness as the background to all particular relationships that exist. So this doesn't make sacredness into a universal or a general universal, or as I like to call it, a universal from the one world that I mentioned before. Another quote, relational value, the value that things might have in particular relationships to other particular things. It is essential here to focus on relationships among particulars. Radical relationalism, which I think is what comes from a Whiteheadian perspective, means to abandon the idea of relations as universal in the one world or in terms of common features of entities. And now I'm trying to think with Whitehead and develop some elements in that direction. And I want to start with a bifurcation of nature, which I'm not discussing because you all know it. It's the one thing that everyone knows about Whitehead, right? As the foundation, not just of modern science, but of modernity itself, as the self-understanding of modernities. The modern dualistic assumption is rooted in the separation between a world of matter endowed with primary qualities and subjective experience that adds psyche states to matter, and also fact and values, right? And I'm going back to my Michel Hampe here. According to him, science needed the subject of modern metaphysics as an Archimedean standpoint to support the concept of a reduced nature. For this free field of scientific analysis to arise, these excluded secondary qualities had to be placed on a different stage. The modern science, have to be placed on a different stage. The representational subject, separate and distinct from nature. Accordingly, modern science needed the subject both as external sight, where to dump all those elements of nature that did not fit the concept of bare matter, and as its foundation. So I like to call it both at the same time, dumping and foundational ground for the modern ontology of nature. That means that the Eurocentric subject, Eurocentric colonial subject, and the Western concept of nature were born the same day, are co-constituted via the bifurcation as res, as two delocalized universal substances, of course. You can think of res extensa and res cogitans here. Taking seriously the critique of the bifurcation of nature and its colonial shadow implies doing more than a critique of science or reframing nature as alive or as imbued with subjectivity and agency in general. That's not enough. I think there is a more radical perspective can be articulated here. It requires a more radical questioning of the very concept of nature as expression of the one world. I can't go into details here, but understanding the bifurcation of nature in this sense means to think in terms of a multiplicity, criticizing the bifurcation of nature means to think in terms of a multiplicity of worlds as onto epistemic entanglements, where experience and knowledge are in the world, neither detached nor delocalized. The quote is again from Brian Burker, Cherokee philosopher. My experience is not of the world, is a moment in unfolding of the world. I'm moving a little faster here. I want to go towards the next step I talked about the bifurcation of nature briefly and the radical implication that it brings, and I want to briefly refer to Whitehead's understanding of life and see what it means for a concept of biodiversity which is sensitive to decolonial critique. The point about life, as we know for Whitehead, is that there's a moment of rapture, a well of originality and novelty. And that life and death are intimately connected. And there is a way in which we always forget death when we speak about life, but with Whitehead it's impossible to do it because they are intimately connected. So what does it mean if we want to think biodiversity beyond bifurcation, taking seriously this understanding of life? First of all, life is not a thing or a property of something. It is a strategy for the harmonization of complexity that increases intensity and beauty in the Whiteheadian sense by allowing richness of experience, instead of inhibition by a negative prehension of the novelty of the environment and its changes. It originates novelty to match the novelty of environment by anticipation. So life is anarchic and successful through canalization. And we know, I'm not going into the section on beauty in Adventures of Ideas, but beauty refers to high intensity and richness of contrasts, maximal diversity canalized in intense experience as togetherness. As a third possibility between anesthesia, negative prehension of discordances, or evil distraction through discordances. So biodiversity at the first level can be thought in this more complex sense as diversity related to the concept of life. It's a condition for beauty in the world. And that means, for example, to challenge the idea of efficiency in terms of reduction. The efficiency of life is through abundance. But there is more to that. I think it requires also to move beyond, if we take the critique of the bifurcation of nature seriously, beyond thinking of biodiversity as a feature of nature or a feature in nature. Read through this lens, biodiversity can no longer be read as a characteristic of nature, as something separated from people, culture, or society, not even as a characteristic of nature alive. That has to be embedded and entangled with practices. And that means, for example, that it opens a possibility to take on what is called, by movements, grassroots movements on the ground, is called biocultural diversity. Biocultural diversity is a term that comes from grassroots movement and is framed to catalyze resistance against both nature conservation, traditional nature conservation, and nature conservation in the new conservation as resource management, rooted in the nature-society dichotomy. This is a struggle, bottom-up struggle, to defend what Arturo Escobar calls a proyecto de vida, a life project of community. And it is a radical critique of the gene-centric way of understanding biodiversity. And now I keep moving, throwing things at you about what the possibilities are for thinking with Whitehead and opening up the colonial possibilities. I'm not developing them much further. I'm just, throwing a few things. The other point about life as radical novelty, I think, challenges also a reading of Whitehead, which I sometimes think is too Deleuzian. Nothing against a Deleuzian reading of Whitehead, but I think it's very important to articulate the interruption and rupture that the radical novelty can bring, and imbued in the idea of life as a non-social nexus, for example. And this, I'm not going into that, but it's important if you consider that there is a very good and very well-articulated critique of relational ontologies by political ecologists who see in that kind of general relational ontology the risk of not making space for struggle, for radical ruptures, and for separation and distinctions that are important. For example, distinction within the human, across gender, class, and race categories, but not only. So that, I think, is important because a Whiteheadian framework of a relational ontology keeps and maintains the possibility of radical rupture, of radical novelty. Life is a bid for freedom, is an anarchic moment of interruption that can introduce originality, And that means also anarchic subversion and can resist conformation. I'm pushing it a little too far, but I think that then can be leveraged on to support other ways of thinking relational ontologies that are born out of subaltern struggles as interruption of general relational frames, as it is framed, for example, in Sousa Santos' articulation of epistemologies of the South. It would be a whole other thing. I'm going to give a whole lecture about this next week. So this is just very, very brief. Another very important point that I want to make here is that a radical relational axiology challenges not just the idea of values of something, value of individual entities, but also of delocalized relations. And it challenges traditional taxonomies. I have problems now. I did it myself in my dissertation, but now I have problems in using Whitehead to construct a hierarchy of intrinsic values, as it has been done in traditional Whiteheadian environmental ethics. Because I think this is a delocalized taxonomy which is rooted in a relational ontology that comes from a certain understanding of how to split and divide the world taxonomically. And Whitehead did it himself in a way, but I think thinking with him means to radically question also that taxonomy, distinguishing plant and animals and humans and making a kind of classification of how the organizational structure is framed. That opens the possibility of a dialogue with radically different taxonomies that are embedded and embodied in other world-making practices. And here a quote from Escobar again, in which the categorization is completely different about what is human and what is not, what is considered to be animal or plant is embedded in other. These taxonomy are embedded in practices, but it also means that the Western dominant hegemonic taxonomy is just as well embedded in Western practices and justified by them, except that it's generalized as a delocalized perspective and put in a superiority with respect to other taxonomies and to other world-making practices. Let me try to go a little further with that. Relationship in a radical relational framework are constitutive, particular, and concrete. Something is what it is because it is how it is and it is where it is. There is an inescapable locality of the actual world. I want to make a step and show the practical implications of this framework. If this is the case, saying something generally like salmon is kin, or mountains is or are sacred, rivers are persons, makes no sense in a delocalized perspective. Salmon is not kin, becomes kin. It is through specific relationship and practices that salmon becomes kin over and over again. And as long as this can be continued, as long as these practices are possible, it's co-constituted by and constituting its relational world that includes the tribes who live along the Anchihuana, the Columbia River, across and in the Pacific Northwest, and embody and reiterate those relationships with salmon. What does it mean for an environmental philosophy or an environmental discourse to move away from generalized articulations such as salmon, orcas? This is rooted in a collaboration that I have. I'm talking about salmon and orcas because I'm learning this from a tribal partner from the Pacific Northwest. But from the question has to shift from do salmon in general, do orcas in general, do rivers in general have intrinsic value, or are subject of rights, are persons, to a different framework of these questions. What are the conditions under which salmon can be kin, under which orcas can be persons or can be made over and over again into persons through those relationships? What are the conditions under which rivers can have rights or can be persons? And the question becomes, how can these conditions be maintained, protected, and secured so that that is made possible? That means that the discussion, the usual and traditional conflict between the traditional environmental approach of inherent value, rights of nature, versus environmental justice and people can be bridged from this point of view, because it's a focus about what are the conditions under which these practices can be continued, supported, and maintained, and that is a question rooted in epistemic and environmental justice. Because it is through the stories, the practices, the complex and ancient relationships within and with the community and territory, and as long as these relationships are and can be actualized, that salmon can be made into kin over and over again. That orcas can be persons over and over again, etc. But, and I'm almost concluding, we know also from Whitehead, there is no simple location. No location is simple. Relation excuse me, I'm trying not to be too long here, but which means that, okay, sorry. Going back to Brian Burkert, reading of Whitehead, relations are not universals that link entities in thought, but are particular and concrete. This also means that there is no simple location. Each location is interconnected horizontally with all other locations with different degrees of intensity. We also know, of course, for Whitehead, that abstraction per se is not the problem. The problem is when abstraction is taken to be the concrete. But I think it's also about understanding which abstraction are we talking about. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness and the fallacy of simple location are just the two faces of the very same coin. If we take something to be simply located, the only way to put it in relation with something else is via abstraction in the sense of vertical subsumption mediated by universals. One location is related with another location via generalization, a map, a construct that extracts particulars from that specific relational knot and moves them into a delocalized sphere to be compared, measured, merged with other particulars in a different relational knot. This delocalizing extraction is taken to be the concrete. If there is no simple location, however, each location is already in relation with other locations in a multiplicity of entanglements that overlap and exceed each other. One world universalism and absolute of simple location are the two faces of the same coin, because the horizontal encounters between particulars is taken to be impossible. It has to be mediated by a vertical delocalizing abstraction or subsumption from the point of view of the hegemonic gaze. But abstraction takes place horizontally as well, in the Whiteheadian sense, as selection, as highlighting, as focusing, as leaving out. Abstraction is a set. It's not just an epistemic process, it's an onto-epistemic process, so it's ontological as well. But in a horizontal movement. And I don't want to make it in an idealized way. That leads to conflicts because the question is about the importance of what is left out. But it changes the framework if it's read through horizontal relation. It leads to the invisibilization of worlds and conflicts among worlds, but also possibly to horizontal encounters, translocal encounters across worlds that might lead to reach contrast. And this is my last point. Is there a way, maybe, to bridge from a Whiteheadian perspective to the language of the pluriverse, which has been developed by the Zapatistas and defined as the world where many worlds can fit? The pluriverse is about horizontal encounters, alliances, and conflicts among worlds. It is about the possible cohabitation of worlds, not of different views of the same world, which is always already assumed, but of worlds, each one local and universal at the same time. And I think that Whitehead expression, the many become one and are increased by one, serves, I find it useful to understand what the pluriverse is. Because it is about no one absolute universal synthesis from the point of view of the one world, but multiple local universal syntheses in the plural, entangled in horizontal and dynamic relations. Can this be a way of bridging in a dialogue that also leaves space for non-understanding and equivocation to what anthropology Marisol de la Cadena calls the uncommons? The negotiated coming together of heterogeneous worlds and their practices as they strive for what makes each of them be what they are, which is also not without others. That does not necessarily require an including into one another. It doesn't even require a complete understanding of one another. They can encounter and exceed each other. The space of equivocation can be left as a place of encounter. The debate about the importance of what is left out and of abstractions in a horizontal relation, which also includes conflicts. Again, I wanted to provoke, I hope I can provoke some thoughts. I'm leaving it here, and I hope we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you very much.